Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into one of the biggest, most world-changing events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution.
I mean, think about that for a second. How does an empire that huge, that powerful, just collapse in less than a year? Well, that's exactly what happened in 1917. The whole centuries-old Russian monarchy, ruled by the Tsar, it just came crashing down. But to really get how it happened, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the storm that had been brewing for decades.
Right. So this revolution didn't just pop up out of thin air. Not at all. It was really born from this perfect storm of radical new ideas and huge social changes that were sweeping across all of Europe. So this whole period was basically a massive battle of ideas. You had a few key groups. First up, you've got the liberals. Now, they wanted change for sure. Things like an elected parliament, basic rights, but they were kind of cautious. They were all about protecting private property and only wanted men with property to be able to vote. Then you have the radicals. And whoa, they went way further. They were pushing for a government run by the majority, and this is a big one, they supported women's suffrage. Plus, they were totally against the special privileges of the rich landowners and factory owners. So you can imagine, these two groups were constantly butting heads all over Europe.
And then came the idea that would change everything: socialism. This wasn't just a tweak to the system. It was a full-on challenge to the whole thing. Socialists looked around and said, hey, you know this private property thing everyone's so keen on protecting? That's not the solution, that's the problem. It's the root of all our social ills. So their answer was pretty radical. Let the community, the whole society, own and control the factories, the land, everything, not just a few rich individuals. I mean, for the time, this was an absolutely mind-blowing idea.
And it's not hard to see why these socialist ideas really took hold. Just imagine what life was like for the millions of people flooding into the cities for factory jobs. It was brutal. We're talking 15-hour days, wages that were just awful, and living in these cramped, unsanitary slums. And if you were a woman, forget about it. You were getting paid way less than the men, sometimes just half. These weren't just bad conditions. They were creating this huge, desperate group of people who were absolutely primed for a radical change.
Okay, so that's the scene across Europe. But what about Russia, specifically? Well, while everyone was feeling the pressure, Russia was different. It was uniquely fragile. It was basically a giant powder keg, just sitting there, waiting for someone to light the fuse.
Get this, 85%. That is a massive number. That's the percentage of people in the Russian Empire who were peasants living off the land at the start of the 20th century. To put that in perspective, in places like France or Germany, it was more like 40 or 50%. It just goes to show you how overwhelmingly agricultural and, kind of behind the times Russia really was.
And this created this huge, angry divide out in the countryside. You see, in other parts of Europe, you might find peasants who had some respect for the local nobility. Not in Russia, no way. There, it was just pure hatred. The peasants were convinced that the land the nobles owned was their land and they wanted it back. And we're not talking about quiet grumbling here. This was an open fight. They'd refused to pay rent, and it wasn't uncommon for landlords to be murdered. This deep, simmering rage was a key ingredient, something really unique to the Russian revolutionary mix.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got these explosive new ideas floating around. A miserable working class in the cities and an absolutely furious peasantry in the countryside. The powder keg is packed, so what finally lights the fuse? One thing, just one massive world-changing event: World War I.
And once the war started, everything just fell apart with absolutely shocking speed. I mean, 1914 kicks off with this big wave of patriotism, everyone's fired up, but that disappears fast. By 1916, the country is literally crumbling from the inside. The railways break down, food stops getting to the cities, and riots break out over bread. Then comes the final straw, February 1917. A strike started by women on International Women's Day just explodes. The government sends in the soldiers, tells them to shoot, and they refuse. They actually switch sides and join the workers. A few days later, on March 2nd, the Tsar gives up the throne, and poof, just like that, 3 centuries of Romanov dynasty, gone.
So the big question is, why? Why did the soldiers turn? Well, it comes down to one horrifying number: 7 million. 7 million Russian casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The war wasn't just going badly, it was an absolute catastrophe. The army was being annihilated. The soldiers, their families back home, everyone knew who was to blame: the Tsar and his government.
Whatever loyalty they might have had just evaporated in the face of that much death. But here's the thing. The Tsar's leaving wasn't the end of the revolution. Oh no, it was really just the beginning. Because getting rid of the king didn't magically end the war or put food on the table. All it did was create this giant power vacuum. And you know what they say about power vacuums? Someone is always ready to step in. In this case, it was a new and much, much more radical group.
So this new provisional government takes over, right? It's made up of more moderate, liberal leaders. And they make one single fatal mistake. They decide to keep Russia in the war. I mean, can you believe it? For the average Russian soldier or worker, it was like nothing had actually changed. All that anger that had just boiled over and kicked out the Tsar, it was still there, and now it had a new target, the new government.
And right into the middle of all this chaos steps Vladimir Lenin. He's the leader of this super radical group called the Bolsheviks, and he comes back to Russia with a message that was so simple, it was genius. It's known as his April Theses, but you can boil it down to 3 words: peace, land, and bread. To the soldiers sick of dying, he promised peace. To the peasants who wanted to own their farms, he promised land. And to the starving workers in the cities, he promised bread. It was brilliant. While the new government was waffling and debating, Lenin was offering people exactly what they desperately wanted.
And here's the key difference. The Bolsheviks didn't just talk, they acted. On the night of October 24th, while the provisional government was still trying to figure things out, the Bolsheviks launched a coup. It was fast, it was organized. Their armed squads just took over. They seized government offices, arrested the ministers, and by the next morning, that was it. They were in charge. We call that the October Revolution.
Okay, so grabbing power is one thing, but actually building a whole new socialist country from the ashes of an empire, that's a whole different ballgame. The Bolsheviks, who now call themselves the Communist Party, embarked on this massive, radical, and often incredibly brutal experiment to remake literally every single part of Russian life. And under Stalin, who took over after Lenin, we see one of the most defining and horrifying policies of this era: collectivization. The big idea was to completely get rid of private farms. So the state just forced millions of peasants off their land. They had to hand over their land, their tools, everything, and join these huge, state-run collective farms. The government's line was that this was all to modernize farming and produce more food for the country.
But the reality for the people on the ground, it was absolutely devastating. I want you to listen to this quote from a peasant named Afanasy Fribanev. It says it all. He talks about how they registered everything he owned: his horse, his cow, his tools, his furniture, and sold it all. They even took one of his huts. I mean, imagine that. This wasn't some grand modernization project for him and millions like him. This was just theft on a massive scale.
And the result of all this was an absolute catastrophe. The peasants fought back in the only way they could. Many of them slaughtered their own animals rather than hand them over to the state. All that chaos, plus the government taking whatever grain was left, it led directly to one of the worst man-made famines in human history. The estimated death toll: 4 million people starved to death.
So, when we look back at all of this, what's the takeaway? What is the legacy of the Russian Revolution? Well, its impact meant way, way beyond Russia's borders. And it left behind a legacy that is just full of contradictions. It's both inspiring and terrifying. On the one hand, for a ton of people all over the globe, especially people living under colonial rule or in extreme poverty, the new Soviet Union looked like a beacon of hope. This quote here from an Indian revolutionary, Shavkat Usmani, really captures that feeling. He visited in 1920 and saw a land of real equality, the brotherhood of mankind. For millions, the revolution was this incredible source of inspiration, a sign that a better, more equal world was actually possible. But that's where we get to the central, massive paradox of the Soviet Union. Because it's true, it did achieve some incredible things. It took a deeply underdeveloped, agricultural country and turned it into a global superpower that could go toe-to-toe with the United States. But, and this is a huge but, all of that progress was built on a foundation of pure terror, political repression, and the complete denial of basic human freedoms for its own citizens. So what was it? A beautiful dream of equality or a horrifying nightmare of repression? The honest and maybe unsatisfying answer is that it was both. It was an idealistic vision for a better world that was brought into being through unimaginable brutality. And trying to make sense of that complex, messy legacy is still so important for understanding the world we all live in right now.